Hey, what's going on? Sir Blackson97 here, back with another deck profile. Today we'll be profiling the Malefic deck. It's a fun little archetype of Dark Dragon and Machine monsters based on corrupted versions of popular cards throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's franchise history. So what's fun is you banish a lot of these specific cards like Blue Eyes White Dragon, Rainbow Dragon, Stardust Dragon in order to summon their Malefic counterparts. But in some instances, you'll be banishing cards from the main deck. In the case of like Blue Eyes White Dragon or Red Eyes Black Dragon, so in some instances, you might be having a bricked hand or a hand that's a little bit heavier than you anticipate. So cards like Magical Mallet or Malefic Paradox Gear are incredibly imperative just to sort of substitute and sort of keep your hands a little bit more playable and fresh. So without further ado, let's jump into the main deck today, as going into the extra deck without the full context could be a little bit confusing and a bit wonky. Starting off, we have 3 copies of Malefic Paradigm Dragon. Pretty much summon this by banishing their Malefic extra deck monsters. It's vaguely written, so in case we ever get new waves of support, that does also apply for this guy too, which is really nice. A big key thing about Malefics is they require field spells in order to stay on the field. And also typically you can only have one Malefic monster or one with the same name. You only attack with one Malefic monster. That usually applies to most of them. Important thing to note is that Malefic Paradigm Dragon, as well as their Synchro, require their specific archetypal field spell, Malefic World. So this deck profile will be focusing on Malefic World specifically instead of other popular stun variants such as Necro Valley or even the Gear Town variant for those Gadgetron and Reactor Dragon plays. What's cool about Paradigm Dragon is once per turn, you can Foolish Burial a Malefic card that includes spell and traps as well, which is really nice. And then what you can do is return a banished level 8 Synchro monster back to your extra deck and then re-summon it. Ideally, you'll be targeting Stardust Dragon, but obviously it's level 8 Synchro and it doesn't even limit to like Dragon or Machine. So you get a nice little variety of, if I have a level 8 that's banished, I'm retrieving it back with Paradigm Dragon. Plus with 4,000 attack and defense, you get some nice offense and defense. Up next, we have Malefic Stardust Dragon. A majority of the Malefics don't really have much unique effects aside from the aforementioned, you can only have one, you can only attack with one, and then obviously without the field spell, they will disappear. Stardust Dragon's cool is that it actually does have an effect, and much like Paradigm Dragon, it'll banish Stardust from the extra deck, so you don't have to worry about bricking in that instance. What's cool about Stardust Dragon is it does have a unique effect in that field spell cards cannot be destroyed by card effects. So a nice way to protect like those Necro Valleys or even your Malefic World for the cards that specifically needed to be out on the field. Next, we have 3 copies of Malefic Cyber End Dragon. This is one that doesn't really have a unique effect outside of the mandatory Malefic effects. You banish Cyber End Dragon just to special summon it. It's a nice level 10, 4,000 attack monster. So you get some rank 10 options or just easy link material. I say link material because there is a continuous spell in the deck that does rework and bypass that you can only have one Malefic monster on the field. And also you can attack with other Malefic monsters, so beatdown strategies do work in this deck, it's just you do require some specific archetypal help to do that. Next up, we have their ultimate main deck boss monster, this Malefic Truth Dragon. Level 12 with 5,000 attack and defense, that's pretty impressive. You special summon it by whenever a Malefic card is destroyed that isn't Truth Dragon, pay half your life points. You can special summon this card from hand or graveyard, so it's a pretty nice ideal Foolish Burial target for Paradigm, just in case if you want to have a backup plan. If it destroys a monster by battle, you destroy all other face-up monsters your opponent controls, which is a really nice sort of board wipe effect. But it has to be face-up card, so keep that in mind in case you're doing something like Daruma Destruction Cannon, where you want to flip everything face down. That will screw up Truth Dragon's effect. But we are running Skill Drain, and their continuous spell does negate Malefic effects in order to keep them on the field, so that is worth mentioning as well, as there might be opportunities where it won't really matter. Worth noting is that Malefic Truth Dragon just requires a field spell. He doesn't need Malefic World, so if you are running the Necro Valley variant, that is another thing to take in consideration, is that he can be splashed into that as well. Since this is kind of synchro focused, we do have an archetypal tuner. We have Malefic Parallel Gear. We're running 3 copies. 0 attack, which means it's a machine dupe target if you want to tech those in. Just get them free link material. When using it as a synchro material monster, the other synchro material is one Malefic card in your hand. What's cool about Parallel Gear is, aside from the machine dupe shenanigans, you're not locked into Malefic cards because they only have one synchro. So what's cool is you can sub in a lot of the other stuff like Malefic Red Eyes for level 9 synchro plays, like Vermilion Dragon Mech. You can sub in those level 10s like Cyber End Dragon or Malefic Rainbow Dragon to go into stuff like YuGiOh Mech Final Sigma. So it does give you a little bit of variety in sort of an extra deck toolbox. Just kind of look for those level 9, 10, and 12 plays that you'll really benefit from. Up next is 3 copies of the very fortunate Malefic Paradox Gear. If you have a field spell tributed to grab Malefic Parallel Gear from deck, you'll special summon it, and then you'll add any Malefic monster from deck to hand. Ideally, this would set up synchro plays, preferably for their synchro monster, which is level 10, or just set up for any other synchro play you want to make. You can also set it up as searching Malefic Truth Dragon to hand, so when Parallel Gear gets destroyed, you can float right into your Truth Dragon and go to your plays. Malefic Paradox Gear also can substitute for a Malefic card. Whenever a Malefic monster needs to banish a specific card from hand or deck or extra deck, Malefic Paradox Gear can banish itself from graveyard to substitute, which is another nice little way to prevent you from bricking and to just kind of optimize your deck so you don't have to run a bunch of vanillas or cards you may not see much use out of. Up next, we have 2 copies of Radian, the multidimensional kaiju. It's a bit high attack, but considering a lot of our Malefic monsters are bordering on 3k to 4k attack, the only exception being Malefic Stardust, you'll be able to run over a lot of stuff, no problem. We're also running Allure of Darkness, so this also becomes an allure target. You can run Gamma Seal if you do want, just to kind of make sure that even Malefic Stardust can run over stuff, but do note that this is an Allure of Darkness, build, so you might brick if you're not seeing that. Other good substitutes are Pot of Desires, Pot of Extravagance, since we're only really relying on the synchro from the extra deck, or even Pot of Prosperity if you just want to dig for their continuous or field spells. Next up, we have some Foolish Burial cards. We have Armageddon Knight and Dark Grepher. Armageddon Knight, whenever it's summoned, send a dark monster from deck to graveyard. Dark Grepher, special summon it from hand by discarding a level 5 or higher dark monster. And then you can, once per turn, discard a dark monster to send a dark monster from deck to graveyard. You'll discard a dark monster from the hand. It's a nice way to just enable, that's a lot of graveyard setup coming up from just one Dark Grepher. I usually don't see it too often, but it's just nice to kind of discard Truth Dragon in order to mill another card straight into the deck. Malefics do have an archetypal monster reborn, so if you are sending some key play enablers just to get that specific Foolish Burial, don't worry, you can retrieve it pretty easily. Moving on to the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Malefic World. Functions kind of like Bingo Machine Go and is kind of the heart and soul of this deck. While it's face up on the field, activate this effect instead of your draw phase. Choose 3 Malefic cards from your deck. Your opponent picks randomly one of them to add to your hand, shuffle the rest in the deck. We're running 3 copies of a lot of Malefic cards, so if you just want to choose 3 like Malefic Territory, 3 Malefic Stardust, and then your opponent randomly picks one, you'll be able to pretty much sort of skew your draws and make sure that you're getting the right plays that you need. Up next is the very important 3 copies of Malefic Territory. Once activated, activate in Malefic World straight from the deck. While that card is in the field zone, neither player can target a card in the field zone with card effects. So combined with Malefic Stardust Dragon, you've got a nice couple layers of protection for your field spells. It also reworks the effect, there can only be 1 face of Malefic monster on the field. It now becomes, there can only be 1 face of Malefic monster on the field with the same name. During the battle phase, skill drain all your Malefic cards. So pretty much all of them can attack. It does, unfortunately, undo Malefic Truth Dragon and Malefic Stardust Dragon's protection during the battle phase, but during main phase 2, you'll be able to operate as intended. Plus, honestly, it's pretty worth it just to skill drain your own monsters just so you can go for some pretty big beatdown strategies. Definitely worth it. Up next, we have 2 copies of Malefic Divide. This is their archetypal monster reborn. Target a Malefic monster in the graveyard, special summon it, ignoring summoning conditions, negate its effects, and then banish it during end phase. It's just a nice way to intercept an attack if you need to, or just If you need to go in for the OTK, use a couple Malefic Divides, grab some monsters from the graveyard, and go for a pretty big swing on your opponent. Up next, as mentioned, is Allure of Darkness. Draw 2 cards, banish a dark monster from hand, or if you don't have any, send your entire hand to graveyard. Obviously, stuff like Kaijus are foolish burial targets. Even a few Malefic Gears or monsters. We do have ways to retrieve stuff from the Banish Zone, as we are running 2 copies of Burial from a Different Dimension, so it's no big deal if you do remove a key play piece or something you need to start your plays. There are ways to get them back. Burial from a Different Dimension, quick play spell, target up to 3 banished monsters, return them to the graveyard. This will pretty much help recycle a lot of resources and guarantee that we'll be able to keep making our plays and keep our graveyard replenished for stuff like Malefic Divide, or just make sure that if we do Allure of Darkness, a key card, we can just retrieve it immediately. Next, we have 1 Terraforming, searching our field spells. Pretty important, pretty useful. Along with Malefic Territory, we'll pretty much always see a field spell, or not always, but it very much increases the likelihood. Up next, we have Harpy's Feather Duster and Raigeki. Pretty good monster and spell and trap clearing, just to kind of help out those fields, just so we can get those OTKs rolling. Next up, we have 3 Malefic Clawstream. If you have a face-up Malefic monster, target and destroy 1 monster your opponent controls. It's not once per turn, so if you set multiple, you can activate them and get a little bit of a chain going to destroy stuff. It is targeting destruction, but your only requirement is having a Malefic monster on the field, which is the entire focus of this deck, so it's pretty spectacular just to have that form of disruption or destruction on your end. Up next, we have 3 copies of Skill Drain. Pay 1,000 life points. As long as it remains face-up on the field, the effects of all face-up effect monsters are negated. It's a nice way just to kind of floodgate. Not really your opponent, it's more to protect you. Similar to Malefic Territory, it is going to negate your Malefic effects, so stuff like Paradigm or Stardust won't get off their unique effects, but you will be able to keep them without the field spell, and you will be able to attack with others. Unfortunately, it does not negate there can only be 1 face-up Malefic monster, since there was a specific ruling on that, but with running Territory as well, we'll be able to get a lot of cards on the field and not worry about those pesky field spells being in the way. Moving on to the extra deck, we're running 3 copies of their signature Synchro, Malefic Paradox Dragon. When Synchro summoned, target a Synchro monster in either player's graveyard, monster reborn it. You can only have 1 face-up Malefic Paradox Dragon. This one does require Malefic World to stay on the field. But similar to Paradigm Dragon, it's a really good level 10 with 4,000 attack and defense. And if we're using that Burial from a Different Dimension, we can get our Stardust Dragons back into the graveyard as well, just to grab those for our plays too. Next, we're running 3 copies of Cyber End Dragon, just so we can banish for Malefic Cyber End. There isn't really a way we'll be able to summon this, but just for all intents and purposes, we'll cover the effect. You can only fusion summon it with the above materials, that's 3 Cyber Dragons, and it also has piercing damage as well. Up next, we have 3 copies of Stardust Dragon. Whenever a card or effect is activated that would destroy a card or cards on the field, quick effect, tribute this card, negate the activation, and destroy it during the end phase. If you use this effect and it was not negated, you can special summon this card back from the graveyard. We'll be retrieving this pretty much with Paradigm Dragon or Paradox Dragon if we've used Burial to get it back into the graveyard. Just a nice little form of protection just to make sure that our field spells or our continuous stuff like Skill Drain or Malefic Territory are protected. Because your opponent can target and destroy those, no problem. It's just with the added layers of protection like Malefic Stardust or Territory, your field spells are safe, but your continuous spells and other spell and traps might be a bit compromised or vulnerable. So having this guy around to protect you is very much useful. Next up, we have 2 copies of Barricade Board Blocker. If it's link summoned, you can discard a card. During the end phase, add a continuous spell or field spell from your graveyard back to your hand. And also, once per turn, face-up spells you control cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. This is just a nice way to retrieve a lot of our stuff like Malefic World, Malefic Territory, that sort of thing. Any sort of card that really enables your plays or really protects you definitely want to sub in a couple copies of Barricade Borg. Finally, we have a little Nightmare Engine, 2 Phoenix, 1 Unicorn, 1 Griffin. They all have the effect to discard a card, then apply an effect, and then if they're co-linked, you get to draw a card. And then also co-linked monsters gain additional effects based on these Nightmare monsters. Unicorn lets you discard to target and destroy a spell or trap. Also protects your co-linked monsters from battle destruction. Nightmare Unicorn targets and spins back into the deck a card on the field. It can be yours, it can be your opponent's, it can be monsters or spell and traps. Also, it has a bit of an interesting Pot of Greed effect where you can draw a card for each different co-linked Nightmare monster you have during your draw phase. So if you have enough of them stacked together, you typically don't see that in this kind of deck, since we're mostly focused on the synchro or just like big beatdown strategies from the main deck, but it is worth covering in case you do have some setup there. And what's cool about Griffin is discard a card, target a spell or trap in your graveyard. That can be anything, including skill drains, Malefic territories, even Allure of Darkness. You can set it back to your field, but you can't activate that turn. So ideally, you'll target your skill drain in the grave, retrieve it, and then during your opponent's turn, flip to negate. Also, what's cool about Griffin is it does kind of have a floodgate effect of its own. Special summon monsters on the field cannot activate their effects unless they are linked. So it's a nice way to screw with your opponent. It does apply to you as well, but we are running, again, skill drain and territory, so we might be negating our own effects by default anyway and just focusing on big beatdown strategies. That'll do it for today's deck profile. Thank you all for watching so much. This was a fun deck to build. This is definitely, along with the Arctic, this was a long time to assemble, but I'm glad the journey's over and we're able to fully utilize this deck. It's definitely a lot of fun. It can brick, mind you, so a lot of those draw power cards or ways to search out those field spells are definitely important. Just gotta make sure your monsters stick around and your plays are able to go through. But definitely a fun deck nonetheless. A lot of fun attack values in OTK, so it's absolutely worth it to invest into if you're just looking for a fun casual build. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.